In the year of our Lord, 1095, on a cold November morning in the French town of Clermont, something extraordinary happened. Something that would echo through centuries, reshape civilizations, and spill oceans of blood across 3 continents. Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd gathered in an open field. The cathedral couldn't hold them all, these nobles and knights, these merchants and peasants who had travelled from across France to hear what the Holy Father would say. The air was thick with anticipation, breath misting in the autumn chill. Urban was no ordinary pope. Born Odo of Châtillon to minor French nobility, he understood both the spiritual yearnings and earthly ambitions of his audience. He had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of church politics, surviving the chaos of the investiture controversy. Now, he was about to unleash something far greater than any political maneuver. "My dear brothers in Christ," he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "I bring news from the East that should pierce the heart of every Christian soul." What followed was a masterpiece of rhetoric, a speech so powerful that multiple chroniclers would attempt to reconstruct it, each adding their own flourishes. But the core message was clear. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, the place where Christ had walked and died and risen, was in the hands of the infidel. Urban painted a vivid picture of Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule. He spoke of pilgrims robbed and murdered on the roads to the Holy Land. He described churches desecrated, relics destroyed, the very tomb of Christ defiled by the presence of unbelievers. How much of this was true? The reality was far more complex than Urban's black and white portrayal. For 4 centuries, since the Arab conquest of Jerusalem in 638 AD, Christian pilgrims had generally travelled safely to the Holy Land. The Muslim rulers, following Islamic law, had protected people of the book, Christians and Jews who paid a special tax called the jizya. But things had changed in recent decades. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, and fierce warriors from the Central Asian steppes had swept through the Middle East like a storm. In 1071, they had crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, capturing Emperor Romanos IV himself. Now they controlled most of Anatolia, the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was actually the Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who had sent envoys to Urban, pleading for help. Alexios was desperate. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Syria was now reduced to Greece, the Balkans, and a shrinking portion of Anatolia. He needed soldiers, particularly the heavily armoured knights that were the pride of Western Europe. But Urban saw an opportunity far greater than merely helping his Eastern brothers. He saw a chance to unite the fractious nobility of Europe under the banner of the Church. He saw a way to channel the violent energies of a warrior culture toward a holy purpose. Most importantly, he saw a path to healing the Great Schism of 1054 that had split Eastern and Western Christianity. "This land you inhabit," Urban continued, gesturing to the French countryside, "is too narrow for your large population. It scarcely furnishes food enough for its cultivators. Hence, it is that you murder and devour one another, that you wage war, and that very many among you perish in civil strife." This was the masterstroke. Urban wasn't just offering a holy war. He was offering a solution to the chronic problems of European society. The system of primogeniture meant that only the eldest son inherited lands and titles. Younger sons were left to make their own way, often through violence and brigandage. The Peace of God movement had tried to limit this endemic warfare, but with limited success. Now the Pope was offering these restless warriors a chance for glory, wealth, and salvation all at once. "Take the road to the Holy Sepulchre," he thundered. "Rescue that land from a dreadful race and rule over it yourselves." The crowd's response was electric. "Deus vult," they cried. "God wills it." The phrase would become the battle cry of the Crusades, shouted by knights as they charged into battle, whispered by dying soldiers as they breathed their last. But Urban's most brilliant innovation was yet to come. Drawing on centuries of Christian theology about martyrdom and penance, he made an unprecedented offer. Anyone who took the cross and journeyed to Jerusalem would receive complete remission of sins. It was a spiritual blank check, a guarantee of paradise. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins, Urban proclaimed. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. To understand the power of this promise, we must remember that medieval Europeans lived in constant fear of damnation. The Church taught that even minor sins could result in centuries of torment in purgatory. Now the Pope was offering a way to wipe the slate clean, to guarantee entry into heaven. The response was overwhelming. Nobles began tearing strips from their cloaks, fashioning them into crosses to pin on their chests. The symbol of the cross, which had marked Christians since the time of Constantine, now became the badge of a new kind of warrior, the Crusader, the soldier of Christ. Among those who took the cross that day was Adhemar of Le Puy, whom Urban appointed as papal legate to lead the spiritual side of the expedition. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles in France, pledged his vast resources to the cause. The movement spread like wildfire across Europe, but Urban had unleashed forces beyond his control. He had envisioned an army of disciplined knights under church authority. What he got was something far more chaotic and revolutionary. Peasants, inspired by wandering preachers, began to take the cross in vast numbers. Women demanded the right to join the pilgrimage. Even children caught the fever. The most famous of these popular preachers was Peter the Hermit, a small, dirty man who rode a donkey and claimed to have a letter from heaven authorizing the crusade. Peter's preaching drew enormous crowds. Unlike the nobles who needed months to organize their affairs, these common people were ready to leave immediately. This was something new in European history. For the first time, ordinary people were being offered a chance to participate in a great historical event, to earn salvation through their own actions rather than simply through the intercession of priests and the prayers of monks. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnenos, daughter of Emperor Alexios, would later write with amazement about this mass movement. Full of enthusiasm and ardour, they thronged every highway, and with these warriors came a host of civilians, outnumbering the grains of sand on the seashore or the stars in the heavens, carrying palms and bearing crosses on their shoulders. There were women and children too, who had left their own countries. But beneath the religious fervour, other motivations simmered. Younger sons saw a chance to win lands of their own. Merchants dreamed of Eastern wealth. Criminals sought to escape justice under the protection of the Crusaders' cross. Even some of the great nobles had mixed motives. Bohemond of Taranto, son of the Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard, had spent years fighting against the Byzantines in Italy. Now he saw a chance to carve out a principality in the east. The Islamic world, meanwhile, was almost completely unprepared for what was coming. The great unified caliphates of the past had fragmented into competing emirates and sultanates. The Sunni Abbasid caliph in Baghdad was a powerless figurehead under Seljuk control. The Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo controlled Egypt and had recently lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks. Syria was a patchwork of rival cities and warlords. To the Muslims, the Franks, as they called all Western Europeans, were barely known barbarians from the far edge of the world. The real threats were each other and the occasional Byzantine military expedition. The idea that a vast army would march 3,000 miles from Western Europe to conquer Jerusalem seemed impossible. As 1095 turned to 1096, Europe was in motion. Across France, Germany, Italy, and England, men were selling their lands, mortgaging their futures, and saying goodbye to families they might never see again. The age of the Crusades had begun, though none could imagine that it would last for nearly 2 centuries and transform both Europe and the Middle East forever. The die was cast, the cross was taken, and history held its breath. In the spring of 1096, before the princes and nobles had even finished their preparations, an extraordinary sight appeared on the roads of Europe. Tens of thousands of common people, peasants, minor knights, women, children, even elderly monks, were marching eastward. They carried makeshift crosses, chanted prayers, and followed a most unlikely leader. Peter the Hermit was not an impressive figure. Small, dark, and unkempt, he wore rough clothes and rode a donkey in deliberate imitation of Christ. But when he spoke, something magical happened. His words seemed to burn with divine fire. Crowds wept, nobles knelt, and hardened soldiers took the cross after hearing him preach. Peter claimed to have visited Jerusalem years before, where Christ himself had appeared to him in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, commanding him to lead a great army to free the Holy Land. Whether this vision was real, imagined, or invented, thousands believed it. They called him Peter the Little, Peter the Prophet, even St. Peter Reborn. This People's Crusade, as history would name it, was a spontaneous eruption of religious fervour unlike anything Europe had seen. In Cologne, in Trier, in towns across the Rhineland, ordinary people abandoned their homes and joined the growing throng. They sold everything they owned for a few coins to buy food for the journey. Some even freed their serfs and forgave debts, believing the end times were near. A contemporary chronicler, Albert of Aachen, described the scene with wonder. You might see 1,000 strange things among the common people. Some who had no money sewed crosses on their clothes and set out. Others shod their oxen like horses and harnessed them to two-wheeled carts on which they piled their few possessions and small children. But this holy enthusiasm had a dark side. As the crowds moved through the Rhineland, some began to ask a troubling question. Why should we march 3,000 miles to fight the enemies of Christ when we have enemies of Christ right here at home? They were speaking of the Jews. What followed was one of the first great pogroms in European history. In Speyer, in Worms, in Mainz, in Cologne, Jewish communities that had lived peacefully for centuries were suddenly under attack. The crusading mobs offered them a choice: convert to Christianity or die. The Jewish chronicles of these events make for heartbreaking reading. In Mainz, over 1,000 Jews took refuge in the palace of Archbishop Ruthard, who tried to protect them. But the mob broke through. Faced with forced conversion, many chose martyrdom. Mothers killed their own children rather than see them baptized. Fathers slaughtered their families and then themselves, dying with the Shema on their lips. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One Jewish chronicler wrote, Has the like of this been heard or seen? Ask and see. Did ever a people hear of such a thing? Christians walk to the slaughter, as to a wedding. But we go to ours as sheep to slaughter, tested by the Lord to see if we love him with all our heart and all our soul. Count Emicho of Flonheim, a minor German noble who led some of the worst massacres, claimed that a cross had miraculously appeared on his flesh, marking him as God's chosen instrument. His followers believed that converting or killing all Jews was necessary to bring about the second coming of Christ. This was not what Pope Urban had preached, but the forces he had unleashed were beyond anyone's control. Peter the Hermit himself seems to have tried to prevent the worst excesses, but his followers were drunk on apocalyptic fervour. As they moved eastward through Hungary, their behaviour grew worse. They stole food from local Christians, claiming it was their right as holy warriors. When Hungarian forces tried to stop them, they fought back, burning villages and killing anyone who opposed them. By the time the People's Crusade reached Constantinople in August of 1096, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the disciplined force of Western knights he had requested. This was a hungry, unruly mob of perhaps 40,000 people, many of them non-combatants.